Welcome to the in-between,
where shift happens,
the moment between where we are
and where we are going.
We will ask all the questions,
maybe find some answers,
and generally work at being okay.
In the mystery of the in-between.
And for this episode today, we are talking about befriending the darkness. Ooh, I know, eek. that makes me feel squidgy just saying it. But yeah, befriending the darkness. I think that, just to give a little context, we get, I think, so caught up in avoiding like the darkness or anything bad or anything uncomfortable, like all the things, right? In exchange for, like, we want to be in the light and we want to know all the things and we like all the things to be exactly the way we want them, all the stuff, right? And so this understanding that we exist, we need both to exist, like physically and metaphorically and all the other coolies that you can think of.
And both do exist, whether we want them to.
Yeah, whether we want them to or not. So we might as well do it. And so, like, what can we do to befriend and lean into? Yeah. But before we get started, in case this is your first time listening to this podcast, the in-between, we discuss, well, that very thing, the in-between, where like all of life happens. And so the premise of this is that one of us comes with questions. We have agreed upon topic, or mostly agreed upon. Dan was a little hesitant about this one. Agreed upon topic, and then we pose questions that the other hasn't heard before or are unaware of, I should say. So that we kind of are in the practice of the in-between, just kind of sharing from what comes up and what the questions bring up and all the things. So are you ready, kind sir?
I feel like we're already there. Like we started in that squidgy middle.
We're already in the squidge. This is where I live most of my life. That's okay. So, talking about darkness, and obviously I gave a little context of what we're talking about. When you hear the word darkness or the dark, whether it's in like spiritual context or if it's in just an everyday sort of context, like what does that word elicit for you? Like what feelings come up? And maybe it's tied to experiences and those two.
Wow. So something just came to mind I haven't thought of in like years. But when I was little, my bedroom was like at the top of the stairs to what would have been an attic, but was, got finished off. So there were bedrooms up there. And so you go up the stairs and there's my room. And then the other side of my room, there's a hallway down to the other side where there's other bedrooms. And at some point, I don't remember what the movie was. It was probably even like a comedy, but it's this family is in a cabin in the woods or whatever. And like this grizzly bear like breaks in the front door into the house. Now, as a little kid, this like freaked me out.
Right.
I didn't know it. Right. I'm pretty sure I figured it out at some point what the movie was and went back and watched it. And it's like, my recollection of it was not at all like, it was actually very funny and comedical.
Which is most things.
Yeah. Which is most things. Yeah. But I for years would lay awake in bed because from my bed I could see down that hallway and was like, for whatever reason, was expecting a bear to come out around the corner down the hallway like every night, and never like that was just, as a kid you don't think anything unusual of that. Of course, that's a rational fear that there's going to be a bear coming down the hallway in your house, right? But I, and then like years later, like was like, wait a minute, that was like every day. What a weird. But it was the dark. Like the lights would go out, and immediately, like you don't know. I couldn't see what was in the dark, and so it was like totally in my mind of what was going to come out of the dark. That's something. I haven't thought about that in like probably since I had that realization of how not, I don't know, I hate to use the word normal, but how not normal that experience probably was.
Well, I guess it probably was normal because I'll tell you, because I had a similar experience, not with bear though, but like growing up, we had like a long hallway, and then there was my room at the very end of the long hallway, and it was dark, and I always wanted to turn the lights on as I was walking, right?
Yeah.
And then I would try to I'm going to overcome my fear of the dark.
Oh yeah.
And so I would try to walk as far as I could without turning the lights on, right? And so, yeah, it's a really interesting experience. I think, like you say, like in the absence of like being able to like see and put things together, our brains like create the story.
Yeah. Did y'all have a basement growing up?
No basement.
Oh, yeah. So that was the basement stairs growing up. So we had unfinished basement, and the stairs were, just a platform, and then open. The space in between the stairs was open. And so underneath the stairs was like storage or whatever. But the lights in the basement were all pull strings, except for the one above the stairs, which you turned off the light switch above. But so anytime you were in the basement, you had to turn off the lights and walk through basically the dark to get back to the stairs, to a very dim light over the top of the stairs.
Right.
So that was like the fear was like, okay, I'm going to walk up the stairs and not get caught by whatever is going to reach out through the steps and grab you as you're running up,
running and tripping and all the things.
Yeah, exactly.
It's one of those like bad B movie horror films, that someone's going to trip as something's being.
Yep.
Well,
it's like what's in the dark, what's going to reach through the stairs, what's coming down the.
Well, and even to bring it's so fun. We laugh about these like experiences, but then I look at like lifting it from those physical experiences into like emotional or metaphorical, these sorts of like spaces that I have lived from. It's like that.
Yeah.
For me, like darkness is not knowing. And I know like that's what comes up for me, like not knowing or like, and it's not necessarily not knowing like intellectually, but like not knowing what's on the other side, not knowing what is there.
Yeah.
And I think that has like that fear. I don't know. I mean, I can see that in my life in lots of different ways, like, historically. And then, currently it's like, and I think it's natural. I don't think it's anything unique to me. It's like, there is that fear, like of not knowing, the fear of the unfamiliar, the fear of not having necessarily full control of what an outcome may be.
Yeah.
And like how that shapes how we act or our behaviors or our decision making. And then like this whole conversation of like befriending it, it's like, what would happen if we just leaned into the not knowing? And I'm asking this for myself. Like what would happen if I leaned into the not knowing, leaned into not always having to control, leaned into whatever, like, what would that open up? I mean, because I think it does. I think it opens up lots of things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know.
That's to know. Gee.
Yeah. But I what it brings up for me is like, I think it stems from this, for me at least, and I have a feeling that at least some of this is universal. It's this feeling, this desire for safety, which I think can come out as wanting to control the situation, right? Like wanting to control what's going to be in the dark. It's like, well, I can control the dark if I turn the lights on.
Right.
But then I don't ever have to actually look at what it is that I'm feeling unsafe about or what it is I'm afraid of. And I think it's that part of our brain, like that very old part of our brain that is looking to protect us and keep us safe. And literally hasn't evolved to recognize like the world that we're living in. And so any sense of insecurity or danger is perceived as like equally life-threatening as any other. And yet I know the times that I have kind of reached out to befriend the dark, or at least get curious about it. I, you know, they may not have been comfortable, but I certainly have gotten through them. Um, which is not to say that there aren't things in life that are actually dangerous that we do need
Right.
to be cautious of, or protect ourselves from. But I think, for the most part, like our kind of day-to-day experiences, I don't know, it's been really easy to like not want to befriend the dark, because it's really convenient to just pretend.
Well, yeah, and it can be very like protective, right?
Yeah, it's all fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine.
Everything's fine. It's all right. It's all
It's like
right.
the dog sitting in the room that's on fire, that meme, right?
Oh
It's
yeah,
just
yeah.
fine. Everything's
Which is
fine.
fine.
Yeah.
Well, and what kind of like stirred this conversation in my brain is I'm currently reading a book by Barbara Brown Taylor called "Learning to Walk in the Dark," and so she talks about and this is within a spiritual context, um, what she calls solar spirituality, and this idea that we always have to stay in the light and we have to resist and fight the darkness, and we can't like lean into anything that's uncomfortable, and we just have to stay in the light all the time.
Yeah.
And there's lots of folks that like to practice that. Hell, I mean, that would be lovely to be able to practice that. But instead, she is exploring what's called lunar spirituality, is what she calls it, like being able to not like so ferociously avoid the dark or the darkness or those things that are uncomfortable, those things that scare us, those things within ourselves that we're like, oh man, I really probably need to address that. But no, it's not real spiritual. So I need to stay over here and focus on like, positive vibes only sort of spirituality. And so it's been a really interesting just hearing her speak about it, because I think that in this conversation of like light and dark, within a spiritual context, we have historically anything that's light, good, anything that's dark, bad. And like the implications of that are like far reaching, racism, like all
Yeah.
those sorts of
Right.
things,
Right.
is this kind of ingrained uh, idea, right? And I think that she's really trying to challenge that. And, I would like to challenge that as well.
Yeah.
I think part of like spiritual practice and our spiritual path is the ability to exist in both and to lean into both
Yeah.
as a way to support us.
Yeah. Yeah. And what always comes to mind for me in this kind of conversation is you don't like, the whole purpose of being here is to be the thing that stands up in the light.
Mm.
Right. I mean, that's the way I kind of look at life, right? Like, if light was just, before there was anything, if there was what we call light's just shining everywhere. Well, there's nothing to receive it or see it or interact with it. It's just light shining from whatever the source of that light is, right? And so all of a sudden you introduce form, you introduce life into that. And, by the nature of there being life and form, there is going to be shadow, but you need the form, you need the life in order to interact with and see the light, right? So like lunar spirituality is kind of to me, that's a really cool concept, because like the moon is actually reflecting the light. So
Right.
there is the dark side of the moon, but there's only the dark side of the moon because the front side of the moon, or the earth facing side of the moon, is reflecting the sunlight so that you
Right.
can actually see it.
Right.
It's like, so it's got this cool like dichotomy of it. You don't have the one without the other, and you need it. And there's not an absence of light in the darkness, right? There is darkness because there's light, because there's something to experience. And I think that's
Right.
kind of the whole point of being here, is like, we are here to know what it's like to stick things up to reflect the light.
Yeah.
And I look at my life, and I think about things like, if we're only going to focus on, let's say, love, but negate the fact that love comes at the cost eventually of grief. And you're only going to grieve as deeply as you loved, which also means the price you're paying to love something as deeply as you are is the willingness then to grieve it that deeply when it's gone.
Right.
And that can be really painful, but I would argue that it's worth the cost of admission, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, I look at like when I think I probably shared this story on here before, but when my dad died, and to have a parent die, and he was young. I mean, he was 71, right? And I was in my mid-30s. It's like, what a life-shifting event that is.
Yeah.
Because even as an adult, like, your parents are still there. So it's kind of like you're not really out here on your own.
Tethered to something.
Yeah, you're tethered, right. And to lose a parent, all of a sudden there's much less of that feeling of being tethered. Whether you were or weren't, whether I was really tethered at all before that, or whether I'm tethered any less now, it doesn't matter. It's that feeling of like just kind of floating aimlessly, like without that tether. But also, what a beautiful, I mean, I can say this now, years later, not that the healing or grieving has stopped, but having a little distance from it, I can look back on it and go, like, what a, oh man, I don't know, those moments of being like so close to what felt like the meaning of it all, like to be part of somebody's death, to be that close to like having no idea who you are. Right. I mean, it shakes stuff up, man. Let me tell you, right? So to be that close to like, I don't know, helplessness, cluelessness, hopelessness, all of the things that come flooding in at times, certainly not enjoyable while they're happening. But at this point, I'm like, wow, like having processed even some of that, I don't think I would give that up for anything, because I feel like I know so much more about me and life and my dad and the relationship that we had, because I had some sort of willingness to go there and be there. And also I think a belief system that let me do it. But yeah, but that was, that was like the part of the deal, right? Is like you only get to have a relationship that deep because there's going to be a balance of the whole thing, right? It's not just this is great the whole time, and it's not like our relationship the whole time was great and love and fluffy rainbows and light the whole time either, right? I mean, it had its ups and downs and whatever. But yeah, it's like I wouldn't trade it for the world, even though it was like the most painful thing.
Yeah. Well, that just reminds me of like, because that was going to be my next question, like an experience from your own life. So you just slid right into that. Of course. But I mean, it makes me think, just when you look at any like loss of anything, right? So it just makes me think like, challenges in relationships or even an ending of a relationship. And I've had my share of ending of relationships, right? And it's really interesting that I remember like the first like sort of big breakup, and there was like this, it was just terrible. It was just terrible, and just I mean, just this resistance to the experience, and that was okay. I was like, I was going to be upset, and I was not interested in shifting my upsetness, and this is what it was going to be. And so I just allowed it to be. It was really interesting. It was very uncomfortable. It was very painful. Yeah. It was very like all the things, but I had resisted like looking at the pain for a bit, and that was making me more miserable. So I'm like, well, I'm going to try this experiment where I'm just going to allow myself to just feel it and not try to like bypass it, just kind of sit in the darkness. There is that word again, right? Of it, or the uncomfortableness of it. Because things are only dark because we say they're dark, right?
Right.
And so we put that label dark and light instead of just what is. And so I just decided to kind of sit in what is, and it was unpleasant for a bit.
Yeah.
And then one day I woke up and it was less unpleasant.
Right.
And then it got more or less and more or less, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Less and less unpleasant. And then it was incorporated and integrated into my experience, right?
Yeah.
Which is the process of grief, where you have that experience, and then we sit in it and we process it, or we allow it to be, and then it kind of shifts through us. It doesn't ever go away, but its relationship changes, and then we integrate that new relationship, that new change in us, into our life going forward, if we are able. And there's no set time frame and things of that nature. And often, we can get stuck in that. But I just remember it was like I just see the world differently now. Just woke up one day, and it was really interesting. Looking back, obviously in it was like terrible.
Right.
But looking back, it's like, that can be the benefit of not of this of kind of sidestepping this whole dark and light sort of conversation, and just allowing things to be as they are without labeling something as good or bad or light or dark, right? Because I think we get hung up in the labels, and that just messes up a lot of things. But instead of just sitting with what is in our experience, and that's not to say there are many things in our world, as we are currently seeing, that I would label dark and bad, and like other words that I won't say, right? And so I'm not negating that, but more speaking to my own inner feeling in relationship to my experiences. And so it was an interesting process, and I wish I would remember it more and more, because I do get into this habit of resisting and only wanting to be comfortable.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to resist. I'm only going to be uncomfortable. I want to be comfortable. I want to see what's ahead. I want to know exactly what's going to happen. I want to know how others are going to respond. And I want to make sure that they're going to respond the way I want them to, like all the things, right? Instead of remembering that beautiful, like, experience of sitting and allowing things to be as they are, and then moving through that experience. I wish I remember that more often. It's very easy to remember it when we're sitting here talking about it, but
right. Because it's one thing to talk about this conversation in context of like those really like life-changing events, and grief of death and loss, and that makes it feel kind of obvious. But I think it's something else to remember it in like those daily moments of like, I don't know, like there's this, we're not supposed to have things going wrong. Like there's something about like, if you have something going wrong, then you're not doing it right. There's something wrong with you.
I missed the memo.
Right. or at least like, we don't talk about the things that are going wrong. Like culturally, you're not supposed to talk about that, or like you can't criticize a country. That means you hate it. And it's like, no, like you can say the things because you care and you want to make it better and change. And I don't know. I think some of it's a skill set that we probably haven't taught each other enough, or passed down, or maybe didn't really know. But I think like, those day-to-day things, like when, I don't know, friendships, and something comes up that makes somebody uncomfortable, and like the friendship explodes or just fizzles out because that one person didn't want to say that one thing because it felt like so dooming, or so uncomfortable, and really it was nothing at all, but in their mind it gets so blown out of proportion. Or, you know, the work email where somebody responds with like what the actual issue is. Like I have this conversation with my wife a lot, because she and I are similar in the sense that we want to recognize what the issue is, and then like, all right, cool. Now that we know what it is, how can we change it? How can we put in place a plan to fix that? How can we do this better? People like, it's amazing to me that people don't like that. Like that process is so uncomfortable of recognizing that there's something wrong, because it's it's going to point fingers, it's going to whatever it's going to do, right? But we talk about this often, about this idea of like, be careful being the one to bring and I'm really bad at this. Be careful being the one to bring stuff up, because for the people who don't want to see the problem, you are now the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Being the one to bring up a problem that no one else was talking about, you, in their eyes, you are now the problem. And I think we're kind of seeing this a lot, like in a generational thing in the United States, right? Between like, everything is fine and we're just gonna only look at, it's all fine, whatever. And then these kind of up and coming generations of like, what the hell is going on? Why are we not talking about this? Why are we not? And it's like, shut up. Like, you'll understand when you're older or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, no.
Well, and I think, sometimes I think our inability to have those conversations, or to show up in those conversations fully, I think, like, I mean, I can speak for myself, it's, it can be challenging to our own sense of worth and self-worth. Like, something's wrong. That means maybe I'm wrong, or something's wrong with me. Right. And so I think some of that is really ingrained, stuff in our like subconscious. And I think that's sometimes impacts our ability to show up in those spaces in ways that are productive.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, I just wish we could shift the language around the darkness, like, to appreciate it. I mean, even if you think about, we describe the dark night of the soul, like when you have this like experience where you're questioning, like, usually it's in the context of like questioning yourself or your experience or the world or spirituality. Your spirituality is like this dark night of the soul, as if it's something to be scared of. I mean, it's kind of, you can kind of hear the horror music kind of overlaid in some of these conversations.
There's low drone in the background.
But to like experience it as like a fate, like it is a cycle. Yeah. Like, this is the cycle. And, obviously it only has the meaning that we give it. Mm-hmm. But for us not to be afraid of those experiences where, and this is, I mean, obviously it's easier said than done. And it's not like we're going to eradicate fear, because that's not even the goal. The goal is like to be okay with the fear. Yeah. And then to lean in ways that are safe, in the time. It's just, I think it's just this language of the darkness being bad and something to be avoided. And it's really trickled down into like everything. Like, it's just like in every aspect of our awareness. And I know that this is like, I'm sure this is like instinctual from like millions of years ago, right? I mean, you can't see things that are trying to hunt you in the dark, which is why we create fire for warmth and light and all the things, so that we can have more awareness of our surroundings. But I think that if we can even just a little bit begin to lean into more of that discomfort, I'll just call it discomfort, whatever, because darkness it's not just like physical darkness. It can be just anything that's causing discomfort, I think, can be seen as, has been labeled as darkness or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and doesn't it talk to this idea? I think we used to talk about this often. The concept of like, it's not fear, it's the fear of fear.
Oh yes, I have the fear of fear a lot.
Yeah, and I think we all do. I mean, I think that's it, right? Because like, fear is natural and actually helpful. but not when we have a fear of fear.
Yeah.
Because then the sense of fear, like that can be very informative.
Yeah.
But not if we're like triggered by the feeling of fear.
Yeah.
And then we go into like reactionary mode to it. But I think it brings up this, like, going back to the very beginning of this, where you mentioned like that whole idea of like right and wrong or good or bad. It's a very like dualistic kind of thing, and bad is bad and good is good. And so for me to have fear means there's something in me that is bad. Or for me to recognize like it's gonna, because the light reflects off the thing, the form. And so the fear is reflecting back to us. It's informing us what is, but we're living in a world, in a mindset that's like, no, that's bad. And if you see that, if you recognize that, you identify that,
danger.
yeah, then that could possibly be in you. You have that in you. You're bad.
Yeah. Well, I think
the worst.
I think if we could just see emotions as information, just information that we can take and use in the moment.
You could tell them that.
Fear, information.
Tell the emotions that.
Yeah, damn it. But I think that is the work in the process,
yeah,
in the journey, is to do that. And we're not always going to be able to do that all the time, but like to begin to like, oh, this is information. I'm having this feeling. What is this? This is information. What's underneath, right? And so it's the same with a lot of this conversation is, and I think that's what we do. That's how you, like when we're talking about befriending, that's how you make friends. You like ask questions and you learn about it. And then the other person asks you questions and you learn about each other. And then before long, you're not having to like, okay, now what question am I going to ask to learn from you?
Yeah.
Right. It becomes this natural relationship.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of the goal of this conversation, is just to cultivate a different relationship with the things that we see as dark, or things that we see as uncomfortable, a different relationship. And actually probably just to switch the language between dark, bad, light, good. Let's just kind of, let's see if we can begin to shift that too in our experience. Because I think that has lots of implications that need to be shifted. But if we can just see all of these experiences as information, and then I think then we can cultivate a better relationship with all the experiences of our lives, no matter how we label them. Yeah. See, this conversation wasn't that bad.
No.
You survived.
Easy.
You survived. Well, as always, when we come to the end of any conversation, it is not actually the end, because we know this conversation is something that goes on and on and on. So the purpose is just to light the little spark and hopefully continue this conversation. Because I know we will at some point or other. So hope those that are listening will maybe take some of this into your brains and begin to maybe think a little bit more about it and include it in your conversations. So until next time, when we meet you in the in-between, we hope maybe just a little bit of shift happens.
Nobody really enjoys being in the in-between.
But thanks for being here anyway.
We may not have found all the answers,
But certainly some. And maybe more importantly,
a little shift has happened.
and the beauty of it all is that we are not alone in the in-between.
So until next time, we hope a lot of shift happens.